Part of the gospel message, part of the way these stories are crafted for us is to remind us that you aren't the center of the universe, but you do have the universe's attention. God cares about your story. Okay, we have talked about our doubts and we have explored our friendships. Today, we're going to tackle that felt experience of faith. And for that, we want to cover relationship and religion, vegetarians and bacon, Jesus and his nicknames, and finally, a ridiculous race. But first, I want to talk about this for a second, because my formative experiences of faith have largely come from within what we might call the evangelical tradition. And there's a lot of that I love. There are so many elements of things that I have learned through my experiences with various evangelical churches that are very much part of Commons and how we express ourselves today. But one of the things I've always had a bit of a love-hate relationship with is this idea, or maybe this implication really, that faith has to be something you feel in your heart all the time. So much of my experience of church has been built around this expectation that all the music we sing, all the language that we use has to land emotionally for it to really count. And you may have heard this one before, right? Christianity is a relationship, not a religion. And I embrace that. Of course I do in some sense, right? I just talked about how my faith can feel like a friendship for me. But at the same time, I think one of the saving graces of my faith is that Christianity has also been able to be a religion for me. A set of practices and rhythms, a community that I choose to participate in, specifically when sometimes the relationship side just doesn't feel as real as it once did. In fact, I would offer that Christianity as religion, as community that I participate in to order my life around values that transcend my emotions, that has actually been just as important to me over the years as my relationship with God. I remember talking with my son, it was about a year ago now, and I was picking him up after school. And on that day, he had been comparing dietary practices with some of his friends in class, and I have no idea how that started, but he found out that one of his friends didn't eat bacon. And so he said to me, "Dad, we don't eat bacon because we're vegetarians, but my friend doesn't eat bacon because he's Muslim. Are Christians allowed to eat bacon?" And so I started into a bit of a history lesson about dietary restrictions and Christian practice, and I was building up to this big landing where I was going to tell him that in Christian practice, nothing that goes into you, nothing you eat can make you unclean. What matters is what comes out of you, how you treat the people around you. And he said, "I'm not interested in any of that, Dad. I just want to know if Christians can eat bacon." And I said, yes. Maybe a little deflated, I wasn't going to get to pontificate the way I wanted, but then he asked me, "Well, I'm a vegetarian, am I also a Christian?" And I realized that was the real conversation that day. And so I said to him, "Well, eventually, you'll have to decide that for yourself. That's part of the beauty of Christianity. You're never forced to be here. But until then, yeah, you are a Christian. Because that's the story, that's the tradition through which our family explores who God is and understands how God has been revealed to humans. You get to choose for yourself, but you're also part of a family and community and tradition that counts, even while you're figuring it out for yourself." And the truth is, looking back, what I realize now maybe a little bit is that I think I was saying that as much to myself as I was to my son, even at 46, even as a pastor, even as someone who has very much chosen this story for myself. My faith is both the relationship that holds me and the religion that forms me. And that's not to diminish my affinity for God. In fact, that's exactly what I want to talk about today, all of our felt experience of the divine. But I do think sometimes, at least within the evangelical tradition, our language can at times diminish the full scope of what it means to follow the way of Jesus in the world. there are times I feel very close to God. And I pray to God. I feel even like I hear from God in terms of determining my steps and guiding my choices. But perhaps the majority of what I might call my faith is really about ordering my life around the teachings of the person who I believe is the truest representation of divine character. And the closest I will ever come to understanding God this side of eternity. And the thing is, the emotion that I would associate with that expression of my faith is probably something like conviction or purpose, maybe even courage on a good day, but not necessarily the kind of romanticized emotions that often get a lot of our attention within our gathered worship experiences. Now again, don't get me wrong, it is beautiful to be caught up in a moment of worship and to raise your hands and to feel the presence of Spirit, to give yourself over to that encounter. But anecdotally, I know that for a lot of us here in this room, particularly, though not exclusively men here in this room, the felt experience of faith has often been talked about in ways that are maybe a little bit too narrow, in ways that are not fully reflective of the breadth and the depth with which the New Testament talks about our relationship to Jesus in all kinds of different ways. The thing is, I don't only feel my faith in my heart. Sometimes I do, but sometimes I feel it in my gut or in my intellect or in my conviction for the kind of man, the kind of person that I want to become. All of that is valid. And it's that combination that makes me feel like I can hold on to all of this for the long haul, because it's actually the breadth of experience that feels robust enough to carry me through the ups and downs in some of my emotions. And to talk about that today, I want to go to kind of an interesting passage. It's one that we've talked about before, but I want to come at it from a slightly different angle today. In this series, we've been in the book of John a lot. Both Bobby and I have turned there in the last 2 weeks, so why don't we return again today? This is John chapter 20. And interestingly, we're going to pick up right where we left off with Nicodemus when he collected the body of Jesus with Joseph of Arimathea 2 weeks ago. This is 20, starting in verse 1. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "Look, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb. We don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but didn't go in. And then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head, the cloth that was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and he believed. And a couple interesting parts here. First, though, we have this disciple Jesus loved, and maybe we should start there. I mean, what's up with that, right? Well, there's a couple different ways we can think about this. First, I guess it's possible that Jesus just really liked this dude and went around reminding everyone of it regularly. Like, hey, everyone, these are my friends. This is Peter, John, you know Matthew, and of course, the guy I love. I mean, that's not totally out of pocket for Jesus to give some wild nicknames. Peter was a nickname. He took a guy named Cephas and started calling him the Rock. He had a pair of brothers that he called the Sons of Thunder. Even Mary Magdalene, who started this passage, traditionally her name has been understood as a reference to her geography, Mary of Magdala. But at the time she was around, the town of Magdala, as we know today, it wasn't actually called that. It was likely called Magadan in the first century, and possibly was renamed Magdala specifically because of Mary's notoriety. And if that's the case, then the name Mary Magdalene probably comes from the Aramaic word Magdala, which meant tower. as in Mary, the tower of strength. After all, she's the one going to the tomb to tend to Jesus' grave while all the men are hiding in the basement. So it was pretty common for Jesus to notice something about someone and to name that uniqueness for them. I really like that, by the way. I've never really had a nickname. They called me Slam Duncan for about 12 days in junior high, but that never really stuck. So I'd like to know what Jesus would come up with for me. By the way, you don't have to make up weird nicknames for your friends, but you absolutely can tell them what you appreciate about them. I need to do that more. I'm going to try. Let's do it together. Still, I tend to doubt that the beloved disciple really was ever a nickname that Jesus used for anyone. That feels a little uncomfy. And in fact, scholarly consensus seems to be that this is a nickname the author has given himself, which presents some unique challenges. Because generally we think that John was the last gospel written, possibly quite late in the first century, which likely means the author was not an eyewitness to Jesus, not one of the original disciples at all. And that means that if he has given himself this nickname, then he is writing himself into the story as a literary device, almost as an avatar for us as readers to imagine ourselves as if we were part of the story too. That means that as you read John, you are, in a very real way, the beloved disciple. I am the beloved disciple. This author wants all of us who have come in the years and centuries, even millennia after Jesus walked the earth and still found ourselves gripped by his life, to know that we are there in the story. We are all the beloved disciple. In fact, I think this author wants us to know that our experience of Jesus is in some way on par with every other experience of Jesus throughout history. And there's something quite compelling about that, I think. This democratizing of Jesus that the early church participated in. I mean, even Paul does something similar in his own way, right? Like, he claims to have an encounter with the risen Christ, but if you read the story, it's a spiritual encounter that no one around him sees. And yet in his mind, that encounter places him on equal footing with the disciples who walked and talked and ate with Jesus. And that actually seems important to me. That the early Christian community resisted the urge to play the degrees of separation game. Paul can be an apostle. The author can be part of the story. Your encounter with Jesus, thousands of years later, as unique as your journey through this world, it is just as valid as Peter the rock, James and John, the sons of thunder, and maybe even Mary the tower. See, I think one of the things that hopefully we all come to learn as adults is we're very rarely going to be the center of attention. Sometimes we handle that well, sometimes not. Sometimes we grasp for attention in the worst possible ways. But hopefully it's something we make peace with as we grow. At least I hope so, because my daughter, who is 4 years old right now, is just discovering that she's not always the center of attention. To be fair, she has been for all of her life so far. But now, anytime mom and dad want to have a conversation, it's her cue to make some noise or jump in the middle or find her way into that moment. God forbid mom and dad should be able to laugh at anything without her approval. But part of the gospel message, part of the way these stories are crafted for us, is to remind us that you aren't the center of the universe, but you do have the universe's attention. God cares about your story. And that feels like something I could build my identity around. Still, I want to look at the details of this narrative as John tells it. Early on the first day, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "Look, they've taken our Lord out of the tomb. We don't know where they've put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb, and both were running, but the other disciple, that's me, the one that Jesus loved, I was on my game that day, so I let my feet fly. And I outran Peter and reached the tomb first. By a mile, actually. He was very slow. Still, when I got there, I bent over and I looked in at the strips of linen, but for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to step across the threshold. So here I was, frozen outside when Simon Peter finally comes along behind me. Remember, I was much faster than him. I always was. Jesus loved that about me. But Peter finally got there, and remarkably, he goes in without any hesitation, straight into the tomb. He sees the strips of linen lying there, just as I had. He sees the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head, just as I saw. And it was still there, lying in its place, separate from the linen, when he turns back to look at me. And so finally, I, who had run much harder and much faster and who'd reached the tomb first, whose heart and lungs were beating their way out of my chest, who was terrified and ecstatic about the possibility of what all of this could mean, I finally went inside. And I saw, and in that moment, I think maybe really for the very first time, I trusted my friend Jesus in everything he had said. Like, it's one of those moments where the beauty of it almost covers up the absurdity of it. And I know you've heard this before. I've talked about this before from this stage, but here's what I want you to notice about this story today. The beloved disciple, the disciple who writes himself into the story, resting his head on Jesus' chest in chapter 13. The disciple who, for most of this gospel, is meant to carry the weight of representing the deepest, most affectionate, most personal relationship to Jesus that any of us can have. Here in this climax, this pivotal moment where he's about to encounter resurrection, that disciple frames this moment in terms of a foot race and a physical hesitation to step inside the tomb. And for me, it's like all of the emotion, the love, the relationship of the story, all of it that has been building throughout all of the gospel now gets poured out in physicality. And it's not tears, although there's nothing wrong with tears. And it's not worship, although there's nothing wrong with worship. It's not in being overcome with emotion, though there's nothing wrong with being overcome by emotion. But here, in this pivotal moment, the character that is there to ground all of our emotional connection to Jesus expresses this moment in burning legs and beating chest, in fighting with his body to take one more step toward the hope that terrifies him most. Here's the thing. Faith is not objective. It's not, I'm sorry, it's subjective. It's personal and it's anecdotal. It's weird stories about beating your friend in a foot race to the tomb. It's conversations with your son about bacon. It's the moment where you know beyond any doubt that God showed up in your life, but you also know that if you told that story to anyone around you, they would look at you with blank stares. Or worse. But at the end of the day, your faith is really nothing more than a collection of unnecessary anecdotes, just like it was with the beloved disciple. And yet, here's what I want you to see today. Your anecdote can be as emotional as laying your head on the chest of Jesus. Your anecdote can be as physical as being out of breath, racing your friend to see what's happened. Your anecdote can be hesitating to take the final step to give yourself over to faith. Your anecdote can be the way Christian community has surrounded you and held you and helped you keep your values even when you struggled to believe in them for yourself. Your anecdote can be an experience of God so uniquely bizarre it makes absolutely no sense to anyone else why it matters to you. But this is the point. Faith is a lived experience, and your lived experience can be as perfectly unique as you are. So while it is beautiful to listen to the stories around you and to expand your imagination by hearing about how others experience the divine, there is less than zero value in comparing all of your unnecessary anecdotes to anyone else's. Your faith doesn't need to look like theirs. Your emotions don't need to express the way the person beside you does. And so whether you're laying your head on the chest of Jesus or racing your friend toward your hope, whatever feels more descriptive of your experience of faith, just know Your anecdote counts. See, here's how I hold on to faith. I come to church and I sing even when I don't really feel like it. And I pray sometimes even when I don't want to. I push myself to follow the way of Jesus even when I'm struggling to. But it is not because I'm trying to live up to anyone else's expectation of what faith should look like. It's because I have my own unnecessary anecdotes, personal stories of ridiculous races that remind me that this story is worth leaning into. And there has been enough gravity in that lived experience to keep me holding on. And I think sometimes, if we allowed ourselves to believe in our own personal anecdotes, without measuring them against how the person beside us expresses their faith story, their faith journey, their emotion of being connected to Jesus, we might realize there's more gravity in our story than we had realized to begin with.
Hey, Jeremy here, and thank you for clicking through to watch that video. If you're intrigued by the work that we're doing here at Commons, you can, of course, hit subscribe to keep up to date with all of the content that we're posting here on YouTube. You can head to our website at commons.church, and you can find us on all of the socials at Commons Church. You can also join our Discord. There, the community is having all kinds of conversations about how we can encourage each other in the way of Jesus. Head to commons.church/Discord for the invite there. Also, leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you and all the ways that you are journeying on this path toward Jesus. But thanks for tuning in. Thanks for all the ways that you contribute to this conversation together. We'll see you soon.